Good evening, friends, and welcome to the 10th PESIC Colloquium on Sustainable Agriculture. It's great to see so many people out tonight. My name is Matt Liebman, and I work at Iowa State University in the Agronomy Department. And tonight, it's our good fortune to hear from the noted author and environmentalist Bill McKibben. Bill has been a staff writer at The New Yorker magazine and is a frequent contributor to Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, and Outside magazines. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, was the first book for a general audience about climate change, and it's been printed in more than 20 languages. His new book, Earth, with two A's, subtitled Making Life on a Tough New Planet, revisits the challenges posed by climate change and explores possible strategies for dealing with it. Bill's also spoken and written extensively about alternative energy and economics within the context of sustainability and resilience. And I expect that tonight he'll share some of his views on those subjects as well as on climate change. The PESIC Colloquium on Sustainable Agriculture is named for Dr. John Pesek, an emeritus professor of agronomy and former dean at Iowa State University. Throughout his long and distinguished career, Dr. Pesek's made important contributions to human well-being through the disciplines of agronomy and soil science, and he's also addressed in considerable depth and breadth the challenges and diverse paths to sustainability in agriculture. This series honors his lifelong commitment and contributions, and I thank him for those. In anticipation of tonight's event, Dr. Pesek and I communicated about Bill McKibben's writings. Dr. Pesek indicated that he'd be interested to hear Bill's views on how we should prepare to manage food production as climate change occurs. This task would seem to be consistent with the mission of 350.org, the international organization that Mr. McKibben founded, whose mission is to inspire the world to rise to the challenges of climate change with practical actions. Mr. McKibben's visit to Iowa State University has been made possible by the work of Ms. Marcia Manier and the staff of the Iowa Environmental Council. It's also been made possible by generous donations from the Bioethics Program, the Committee on Lectures, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, the Departments of Agronomy, English, Natural Resource Ecology and Management, and Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology, the Bioeconomy Institute, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Practical Farmers of Iowa. On behalf of the PESIC Colloquium Committee, I express my sincere thanks to all these organizations for their assistance and support. Let us now welcome to Iowa State University, Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you very much. What a pleasure for me to get to be here. The last time I was in Ames, it was midwinter, and I came to speak at the Leopold Center, and I stayed out on Onion Creek, and I got to go for a magnificent ski down Onion Creek. It couldn't have been more fun, and now I get to be here in the middle of your glorious fall. I drove today from Iowa City over here and passed. I confess, since I live in Vermont, I'd be a poor son of Vermont if I didn't sort of claim that our foliage took precedence, but your beautiful yellows are very nice in a kind of understated Iowa kind of way that I quite endorse. It's good to be here, and it's especially good to get to be here on this occasion to give this lecture in honor of Dr. Pesek. I'm going to end up talking almost without even trying to about agriculture, because agriculture, i.e. what's for dinner, is the most basic of human questions, and called into question, really for the first time in 10,000 years, by what it is that we're now doing to the planet. And that's what I want to talk about. And I apologize from the beginning, because part of my role in life is to be a professional bummer-outer of people, and that's what I'm going to do for a little while. I'm going to get past it, and we're going to end in a better place, but we're going to spend a little while in the valley because there is no sense not being on kind of the same page about where we are, understanding as viscerally as possible the situation that we find ourselves in, because it's unprecedented and dangerous and fascinating. I wrote the first book, as Matt said, about climate change for a general audience. I wrote it 21 years ago in 1989. And at the time, we knew most of what we needed to know about climate change. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put CO2 into the atmosphere. And we knew that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. Okay? It's basically all you need to know. The only thing we didn't know 20 years ago was how fast this was going to pinch. And the answer that's emerged over those 2 decades is it's pinching a hell of a lot faster than we thought it was going to, and a lot harder. The story of those 20 years has been the rapid emergence of symptoms of anthropogenic global warming. So far, human beings have increased the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree. 20 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that was enough to cause real disruption. It's only about 2 watts per square meter of the Earth's surface of extra solar energy, but it turns out that it is enough. That pretty much every physical system on the planet has been thrown out of kilter already. I published a kind of follow-up to The End of Nature earlier this year, a book called Earth, spelled in an odd way, E-A-A-R-T-H. The argument implied in that title was that we had become a different planet already, that change was sufficient, that it no longer made sense to think about this place where we live as quite the same place as the one we were born on to. I could spend a long time here tonight detailing all the evidence laid out in the very grim first chapter of that book. Very grim, if I say so myself. I'm not going to bother to do that. I'm just going to talk about data that's emerged in the few months since that book was published. Just talk about what's happened over the last 3 or 4 months around this planet, because it provides all the glimpse one will ever need across the northern hemisphere. There are lots and lots of people relieved that the summer of 2010 finally came to an end, because it was the most brutal summer the northern hemisphere has ever seen, and one that gives us a good foretaste of what climate change looks like in its early stages. 19 nations set new temperature records in the last 3 months, itself a record by a very large margin. Some of those records were really almost unbelievable. We were talking with our 350.org crew in Pakistan in late May or early June. And one of them said, very hot here today, which I was surprised to hear, because it's usually hot in Pakistan, hot enough that no one would think to make note of it. Okay? I said, really, how hot? He said, we set the new all-time Asia temperature record today, 129 degrees. It got to 100 in Vermont today, this summer, which is pretty unusual, and we felt pretty hot. But I sort of reminded myself that day, instead of complaining, to try to imagine what it would feel like 30 degrees warmer, and for 98% of Pakistanis minus all the air conditioning, That kind of heat obviously causes all kinds of things to happen, and all kinds of things were happening around the world this summer. The Arctic continuing to melt. When its melt season finally came to an end in late September, the computer jockeys were estimating that the volume of ice in the Arctic had set a new record low. The northwest and northeast passages were both open at the same time for only the second time in human history. In fact, there was the first time being the year before. There was a yacht race around the northwest and northeast passages this year, territory that until 5 years ago no one thought humans would ever be able to navigate. You watched the pictures from Russia, where they had the most epic heat wave they've ever had. It had never reached 100 degrees in Moscow before. It was 100 degrees 8 days in the beginning of August. The fires set off by this phenomenon were eerie, filling Moscow with smoke. More to the point, the drought that it caused was sufficiently severe that the Kremlin decided to stop all grain exports to the rest of the world. They turned ships and train cars around. They're not going to export anything this year and maybe not next year either. The immediate effect of that, of course, was to spike the price of grain on international markets. The price of corn is up about 70% since July. I think it's at about $5.25 or so a bushel at the moment. That sounds great for Iowa farmers, but if you think ahead even a little bit, you don't have to have an immense amount of imagination to realize that what happens in Russia can happen as easily across the Midwest of the United States. And indeed, there was a kind of even more ominous event this summer, one that has or should have real resonance for you guys here. I'm talking about the Great Flood in Pakistan and really about the incidence of flooding in general around the world. I think probably this is the place where climate change will have its most immediate and profound early impact, and especially on agriculture as we're going forward. Hydrology around the world, even with a modest increase in temperature of 1 degree globally averaged, is spinning wildly out of control. The atmosphere, warm air holds more water vapor than cold. The atmosphere is 4.5 or 5% moister than it was 40 years ago. That loads the dice for deluge, for downpour, for flood, and we are seeing it everywhere. In this country this year, just in the last 6 months, we've seen 1,000-year storms in Nashville, which killed a lot of people, in the mountains of Arkansas, likewise, in Oklahoma City, along the Texas-Mexico border, place after place. Wilmington, North Carolina, 3 weeks ago, had its second 1,000-year storm in 11 years, 23 inches of rain over 3 days. My little tiny town in Vermont 2 summers ago, this is a place that should never flood because it's 98% intact forest. It's all in the Green Mountain National. If any place should be able to hold the water, they should. But the rains we now have are falling on a different planet than those forests grew up on. We had the 2 largest rainstorms we've ever measured in back-to-back succession, and by the time they were done, the town had darn near washed away. The governor had to arrive by helicopter. They're still fixing the roads. This should come as no news to any of you. I was in Iowa City yesterday, which between Iowa City and Cedar Rapids found billions of dollars, I guess, in damage from their floods. We drove across the interstate getting here today with people pointing out to me the gray fields that had been flooded earlier this year. I hear that even the football stadium here found itself getting its feet wet as the summer wore on here. That kind of change is clearly accelerating dramatically. The most vivid and horrible taste of it was what happened in Pakistan earlier this year, up in the Khyber Pass, up in the headwaters of these rivers, which were already high because those high temperatures that I described earlier were causing record melt in the glaciers that feed those rivers. So the rivers were already pretty high. Up in that part of Pakistan, which normally gets about 3 feet of rain in a year, the monsoon rains stalled, and over the course of about a week, about 12 feet of rain fell in places. The Kabul River, one of the main tributaries of the Indus, the highest flow that had ever been recorded before was 250,000 cubic feet a second, and that was in 1929. In early August, it reached 400,000 cubic feet a second, and then the rain gauges washed away, the flow gauges washed away, so nobody has any idea what it got to. But it was enough as it worked its way down across Pakistan to put between 1/3 and 1/5 of the country underwater. 7 million people are homeless as a result, i.e., pretty much 2.5 Iowas without homes as a result of that flood, roads gone, bridges gone. Pakistan was not a particularly easy place at the beginning of the summer. It was poor, it was chaotically governed, on and on and on. But people there are going to spend the next decade trying hard to get back to where they were at the beginning of the summer. The idea that there will be something called development going on is folly. We can't live on the kind of world that we are allowing to build right now. Altogether, their paper in Nature 3 or 4 weeks ago demonstrating the total flow of rivers and streams around the world because of this increased rainfall and increased melt is up about 10% over the last 20 years. That's just incredible change in a basic physical phenomenon. The throughput, all that extra energy that we're trapping in this narrow envelope of atmosphere is expressing itself in all kinds of ways, including that cycle of evaporation and precipitation. And here's the thing to bear in mind. All that's happened so far has happened with an increase in temperature of about 1 degree globally averaged, as I said before. The climatologists are pretty clear that we've already bought ourselves another degree from carbon we've already emitted. Coal and oil and gas we've already burned. Some of that heat is stored in the ocean for a while before it fully expresses itself into the atmosphere, but it's coming. More to the point, they warn that unless we get our act together very quickly, getting our act together meaning getting off fossil fuel in rapid order, much more quickly than is politically or economically convenient, unless we do that, the temperature will rise 4 or 5 or 6 degrees before the century is out. Not the worst case scenario, the middle case estimate. If 1 degree melts the Arctic and causes the kind of chaos I have described, we truly do not want to find out what 4 or 5 degrees will do, because everything we can guess about is grim, including its effects on agriculture. Forget even these questions about drought and deluge. Simply that increase in temperature, according to the most recent studies from Stanford and the University of Washington, are enough to reduce grain yields 30-40%, simply because we'll take the temperature, especially the nighttime temperature, beyond the range that these plants are capable of dealing with. You know that when you get the temperature up above a certain temperature day after day, corn won't really fertilize, yields begin to drop. We're apparently already seeing that effect, and pretty dramatically, with rice around the world. I guess what I'm trying to say is this is a very big deal. It is the biggest deal that human beings have ever wandered into. And we have to work with great speed, great urgency, great commitment, great cleverness, not to stop it. We're not going to stop it altogether, but to keep a very difficult century merely very difficult and not impossible. Okay? That's the task ahead. All right, I'm done with grim statistic, and I apologize for dragging you through it, but there you are. That's the thing we have to work on. Now let's talk about how we're going to work on it. Okay? How we're going to build a world, keep a world that it's possible to operate, especially its agricultural systems, the way that we're used to. That task, most of all, involves this chore of getting off fossil fuel and onto something else. All right? The most obvious thing to talk about as we do that would be engineering and technology and all the cool things we could do to power our lives that didn't involve coal and gas and oil. And I'm hardly going to talk about that at all, because I think that's the easy part. I think that's what we're good at. We're pretty good at coming up with things. In the last 20 years, we've really gotten good at solar power. It's no longer some kind of theoretical idea. You can do it. My house runs on solar power Wind energy is the fastest growing source of electric generation around the world. These things are possible. The question is, will we muster the political will, not the engineering know-how, but the political will to put that engineering know-how to work fast enough to matter? Will we be able to force this pace fast enough to make any real difference? Of course we're going to get there in 70 or 80 years. There's no doubt about that. The problem is we don't have 70 or 80 years. We have to move now, and we have to do it in the face of determined opposition from people who don't want to change. And most of those people are in the fossil fuel industry, because the fossil fuel industry is the most profitable industry that human beings have ever engaged in. 8 of the 10 largest companies in the world are in that business. ExxonMobil made more money last year than any company in the history of money. Okay? And the thing to remember is that it's not some sort of mistake that's the problem. It's not when BP, egregiously drills someplace where they don't know how to do it and cause a spill. It's the daily operation of the business model of the fossil fuel industry that causes the problem that we're in. That business model, their immense profitability, is predicated on the fact that they are allowed to use the atmosphere as an open sewer into which to put their waste for free. Okay? That's why they make so much money. And that's why the planet is heating up so fast. Okay? And it's why, so far, we've done nothing about it. The Senate this year refused to even vote on the incredibly mild and tame global warming bill brought before it. A bill so small that it wouldn't have had that much impact, but at least it would have been some kind of start, some kind of signal to the rest of the world that we were serious about doing something. They wouldn't even take a vote on it, thus preserving intact a perfect 20-year bipartisan record of accomplishing nothing on this topic. To change that will require building a kind of movement, since we're never going to have as much money as ExxonMobil, my guess is we could all pool all our spare cash and we would still be somewhat short, Since we're not going to do it that way, the question becomes, can we build a movement that can match in bodies and spirit and creativity that advantage in money? And that's what I've spent my last few years trying to do. And it's what I'm going to talk about now for the rest of this time. I'm going to keep talking confidently because that's just what I do, but you need to realize as I switch to this subject that I'm no longer dealing in cold, easily footnotable, hard fact, okay? We're now moving into a realm that's much more an art than a science. Nobody really knows how to build political movements. Mostly, I'm just going to tell you a few stories, a few quick stories. Where to begin? Maybe in Bangladesh. I was there some years ago doing some reporting. Bangladesh is one of the most beautiful countries on earth, incredibly fertile, quite crowded, 140 million people in an area about the size of Iowa, but so fertile that they feed themselves. It's where the great sacred rivers of Asia, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, come pouring out of the Himalayas into the Bay of Bengal, and so extremely fertile and magnificent country. They're in big trouble from climate change. As the ocean rises, the salt front is pushing in across this delta, and people are losing their farmland. Those glaciers at the head of the rivers are dwindling. But when I was there, the problem they were having was acute, not chronic. All right? They're having their first big outbreak of a disease called dengue fever, a mosquito-borne disease now spreading like wildfire across Asia and South America. Incidence up about 200% in the last decade because mosquitoes quite like the warm, wet world that we are constructing. In fact, sort of viewed at a sufficient distance from like outer space or something, if people were trying to figure out what we were doing here, a reasonable answer would be sort of mosquito farming. That's sort of what this climate alteration is about. Well, everybody was paying attention to this dengue because it was the first outbreak, and there's pictures in the news and on the TV. And I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so I eventually got bit by the wrong mosquito and got sick myself. And I was sick as I've ever been. I recommend not getting this. But I did not die because I was strong and healthy going in, you know. I remember going to the ward at the hospital, as big as this room, cots as far as you could see, people sitting there shivering. And the main thing that I kept thinking was, boy, is this unfair. When the UN tries to measure how much carbon each country in the world emits, you can't get a number for the 140 million people in Bangladesh. It's a rounding error, okay? The bicycle rickshaw is the main way of getting around. You know, 20% of people are tied into the electric grid. They're not using fossil fuels. That's our job, okay? The 4% of us in this country produce about 25% of the world's CO2. Because we've been doing it so long, about 40% of the greenhouse gases currently in the atmosphere come from the United States. If you do the kind of moral math, it seems to me, therefore, if there are 100 people languishing in a Dhaka hospital from dengue, 25 of them are on us. You know? And once I'd kind of really felt that viscerally, it was harder. I wanted to do more than just the kind of speaking and writing that I'd been doing. But I didn't know quite what to do. I mean, I got back to Vermont. I'm a writer. I live out in the woods. Writers aren't good at any of this kind of thing. We're sort of self-selected to sit in our rooms and type. You know, we don't like getting up and talking, making a fuss, whatever. But I wanted to do something. I called up a few of my writer friends in Vermont and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go up to the Federal Building in Burlington, which is our main city, 50,000 people, so not so big, but we're going to go up to the main city in Burlington, in the Federal Building. We'll sit in on the steps. We'll get arrested. There'll be a story in the paper. At least we will have done something. Okay? All these other writers were just as clueless as I was. Oh, that sounds like a good idea. You know, let's do that. Happily, one of them called up to the police in Burlington. What will happen if we carry out this intrepid stunt, you know? And the police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, you know. So we had to kind of recalculate. And I sent out emails to a bunch of people, said, look, we're going to go for a walk. And we left 2 weeks later from Robert Frost's old summer writing cabin up in the Green Mountains. He's sort of our patron saint, you know, in Vermont, and we walked for 5 days. We slept in farm fields at night. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I had called the Methodist Mafia en route to make sure that there would be, you know, potluck suppers, the sort of Methodist sacrament would be available, you know, throughout the trip. When we got to Burlington, there were 1,000 people marching. Now, y'all are, you know, in a pretty cosmopolitan and sophisticated place with some big cities nearby. To you, 1,000 people is nothing. But in Vermont, with the possible exception of University of Vermont hockey games, this is as many people as have ever gathered in one place at one time. And it was very exciting, and it was enough to get all our candidates for public office to come meet with us, and not just meet with us. They signed this raggedy piece of cardboard we've been carrying across the countryside that said, if I'm elected, I'll work to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050, at the time a very radical demand endorsed only by scientists, not by politicians, but they all signed. Not just the liberal Democrats. The woman who was running on the Republican ticket had said 2 months before, running for Congress, she'd said, 2 months before when she announced, she'd said, I'm not sure global warming is real, more research needs to be done. Which, come to think of it, sort of in this Tea Party moment, may now pass as a kind of progressive position for Republicans on global warming. But at any rate, it was instructive to find out that the more research that needed to be done was on the question, how many people will walk across Vermont and ask me to change my mind, okay? And empirically, 1,000 was sufficient because she signed, and that was good. That's how it's supposed to work. We felt good. Democracy in action. The only problem was to open the paper the next day and read a story that said this 1,000 people that we had gathered might have been the largest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the U.S. And when we read that, this was fall '06. When we read that, I thought, no wonder we're losing, you know? We have everything that you would need for a movement. We have the sort of Al Gore and these great scientists and engineers and economists and all of this. The only part of the movement we forgot was the movement part. There's nothing there to give it any sort of push. Can we change that? And we decided to find out. When I say we, I mean me and 7 students at Middlebury College in Vermont, where I hang out. They were seniors, so they weren't done with school, but they were more or less done with school. And we started sending out emails to people all over the country saying, look, will you help do something like this in April, in 3 months? We need to. Well, we didn't know what to expect. We had no money, no organization, but it turned out there were lots of people around the country who had already changed their light bulbs and already figured out that that wasn't going to stop climate change. And they wanted to do something, but they were hampered by the thing that we all feel confronted with this problem, which is this is a very big problem, and I am very small. It doesn't really seem possible for me to have any effect. So the thought of doing everything on the same day with the same message all around the country was kind of appealing to people. And on that day in April, we somehow managed to have 1,400 simultaneous demonstrations in all 50 states, including a really good one right here. And that was good because 3 days later, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, then running for president, endorsed this 80% goal that we'd set out. And we were frankly feeling quite smug about the whole thing. What a good job we had done, you know. The only problem was that 6 weeks later, in the summer of 2007, the Arctic really started to melt for the first time in a serious way. By the time that summer was over, there was 25% less ice up there than there'd been the year before. I mean, you could just hold up satellite images of the two. These are different planets, you know, easy to see. It scared. So I spent that summer getting phone calls from scientists I've known for a quarter century who'd always been worried, but all of a sudden they were panicked. You know, this is happening way too fast. By the time that summer was over, a couple of things were clear. One, those old targets we'd been talking about were obsolete. What happens in 2050 is less interesting than what happens in 2020. And two, we probably weren't going to deal with it one light bulb at a time, and probably not one country at a time either. We were going to have to try to deal with it one world at a time if we possibly could. That was a daunting thing to realize. Global organizing is difficult because the globe is a large place and because people across it insist on speaking their own languages. And that makes it hard, okay? But we decided we'd try, and in January of 2008, we got a kind of, well, it was both a horrifying and somewhat invigorating gift. It came from the scientific team headed by Jim Hansen, our foremost climatologist at NASA. And his team published a paper saying, we now have enough data to put a number on this problem. And it instantly became, I think, the most important number in the world. What they said was, any value for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is too much. It's, as they put it, not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. That is strong language for scientists to use. And it's stronger still when you know that the atmosphere outside tonight in Iowa and in Iceland and in every other place on Earth is 390 parts per million CO2 and going up about 2 parts per million per year. We're already way too high. That's why it's not a problem for anybody's kids or grandkids. It's a problem that's breaking over our heads right now. That's why we have to act with enormous urgency. That's why the Arctic is melting. We are too high. There is too much carbon in the atmosphere already. So that was the horrifying part, you know, to sort of realize that at some deep level we were not going to stop climate change, though we could still slow it down and ameliorate it and keep it from getting any worse than it has to get. The somewhat invigorating part was that a number seemed to give us something to work with, both because it explained to people what the bottom line really was in kind of the same way that going to the doctor and the doctor said, well, your cholesterol is too high. It's over 200 and you're in the zone where people have heart attacks, okay? That's a useful, all of a sudden, a rare person then turns to the doctor and says, well, I'd like a full disquisition on the lipid system now, you know. Most people just say, okay, what pill do I take, you know? I mean, it's something useful about knowing numbers, all right? Also, the really useful thing was Arabic numerals cross linguistic boundaries. Okay? That means you can make the same argument every place around the world at the same time. That was a good advantage to have because we still didn't have any money. But these 7 kids had now graduated from college. That was good. No more papers or anything. And 7 was actually a good number because there are 7 continents, so each one of them took one. And the one that got the Antarctic also got the internet because it's kind of its own sort of landmass, you know. And off they set to work, and in that case it meant finding people like ourselves who would understand this. Some of them in some places in the world called themselves environmentalists. Mostly people who are working on agriculture, on war and peace, on women's rights, on poverty, and all the things that are called into question when the planet starts to destabilize, on all the things that aren't happening in Pakistan right now because everybody's focused on survival. We asked everybody, so we're going to have this sort of coming out party for this, one day when we try to push it into the information bloodstream of the planet. And for no particularly good reason, we picked October 24th of last year, so about a year ago, October 24th, 2009, and we said to everybody, we need you to do something on that day that'll take this number and make it public. And we didn't know how well it would work because no one had ever really tried anything like this. We gathered in New York City, the 8 of us, about a week beforehand to do all the last chores, put out press releases, but also just to kind of watch for the results to come in because we told everybody to upload pictures as soon as they did whatever they were doing. We got the first sense it was going to work a few days early, 2 days early, October 22nd. And this will tell you the story, just a little bit about how we organized. We'd done these training camps for young people all over the world, one in Turkey for Central Asia and one in the Caribbean. We did one in Johannesburg for people in Africa. We brought young people, 1 or 2 per country from all over Africa down to Johannesburg. And most had never left their country or been on an airplane, but they were terrific organizers, born organizers. And we worked with them for a while, then sent them back out across Africa. We didn't hear much from them because the internet's still pretty notional across most of Africa. You can't just Skype people all the time. But 2 days early, we got this phone call from this 18-year-old that we'd worked with, a wonderful young woman named Lily in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And she was almost in tears. And she was like, oh, the government has just taken away our permit and told us the government's not such a nice government there. Told us we can't do this thing on Saturday. And so we're doing it today before they can stop us, you know, and we're really sorry. We know we're jumping the gun. We hope we're not spoiling it for everybody. And we have 15,000 people out in the street right now in Addis Ababa chanting 350. And I said, Lily, don't worry about the date. It's all right. You know, we'll deal with it. And right after that, for the next 48 hours, the pictures just poured in from everywhere. The next one that came in was from U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan who'd made a 350 with their sandbags and sent us a note saying, we're parking our Humvee for the weekend so we can walk. Before the weekend was out, there had been 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. Okay, I'm just going to show you a couple of images of it, just to make a couple of points. One was that if you have ever heard the trope that environmentalists are rich white people who have nothing else to worry about, okay, it turns out not to be true. Almost all the people who took part were poor, black, brown, Asian, and young, because that's what almost all the people in the world are, okay? And some of the pictures, like this one from Bangladesh, obviously had special resonance for me. We had tremendous involvement for the first time in these kind of issues from religious leaders. That's the head of the Muslim community in South Africa, the head of the kind of animist native traditions, and behind him in scarlet, Archbishop Tutu's successor is the Anglican Archbishop at the head of a huge multi-faith march across South Africa. People came up with enormously creative things to do. That's actually just nearby in Soweto, where they did 350 bungee jumps, but the reason they did them, they hung the bungee jumping line between the cooling towers of a defunct coal-fired power plant. And they sent us a note saying, this is the highest and best use for coal-fired power plants from here on in, around the world. It was really great. The president of the Maldives, entirely Muslim nation in the Indian Ocean where the highest point is a meter above sea level, trained his whole cabinet how to scuba dive. They held an underwater cabinet meeting that day and sent a resolution to the UN demanding that they take this 350 step. I wish that I could tell you that all this had worked spectacularly. It was pretty spectacular. It dominated the news for a weekend, the lead story on Google News and every newspaper. We got to Copenhagen, to the big climate talk 6 weeks later with a lot of momentum. That was great. We got 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target. That was great. They were the wrong 117 nations. They were the poor and vulnerable nations, not the richest and most addicted ones, which, led by our own, were unable to come to terms with reality, and hence the meeting ended in failure and collapse. I was depressed and angry that last day. I was therefore glad. We had the largest delegation at Copenhagen. You will not be surprised to hear that we brought 350 young people from all over the world. They were great lobbyists. That's why all those countries signed on. But that last day, since there was no one left to lobby, their job was to kind of try to buck me up. And they kept coming up and saying to me, one after another, in one form or another, and remember, these are people from countries where power is a little more naked than it is here, and where you don't get kind of the innocence that they kept saying, look, we didn't expect to win in a year. We're up against the most profitable, powerful industry in the world. It's going to take a while. We're going to have to go back and make this movement stronger and bigger, and we will see what we can do. And they were exactly right, and that's what we've done. The next stage in this movement building was last weekend, and I think some of you helped with it. We decided this time to have a global work party around the world, not a political rally, but a work party, and much of it was agricultural in nature. People were planting community gardens, or planting lots and lots of trees, or they were also laying out bike paths, or all kind of things that were useful in their community, and that also allowed us to send a potent political message. At the end of the day, wherever people were, they put down their hammer, their shovel, picked up a cell phone, called their leaders, said, look, we're getting to work. What about you? If I can climb up on the roof of the school and hammer in a solar panel, you can climb up on the floor of the Senate and hammer out some legislation. It's your job, And it was really, really powerful day. We were worried that people wouldn't be ready to do this because it had been such a discouraging year, the failure in Copenhagen, the failure in the U.S. Congress. It turned out to be much bigger than it was. We broke our own record by a large margin. There were 7,400 or so work parties in 188 countries. Every nation on earth except Equatorial Guinea and North Korea took part. And the pictures, there were about 25,000 pictures have flowed into the Flickr account, and I'll just show you a very few of them to give you some sense of the kind of beauty. And it's 7,000 people marching through the streets of Istanbul. It's Kuwait City, which you wouldn't expect this kind of thing to be happening. And just to give you a sense, I guess, those of you who care about these things, what your colleagues look like, who your brothers and sisters in this fight are. Those penguins had been oiled in the big oil spill off South Africa last month, and they were rehabilitated and released on last Sunday, which was good because all the news crews came to cover it. Place after place after place. Bangladesh that day was having enormous flooding, 500,000 people forced from their homes by huge rainstorms, record rainstorms. It didn't matter. There were dozens and dozens of actions across Bangladesh, often as this one, people standing in floodwater, but nonetheless trying to spread the message. You name it, the most unlikely places, all kinds of things going on. picture from Iraq means a lot to me. There were a couple of demonstrations across Iraq. Not an easy place to be doing this kind of thing these days. That demonstration is 5 times larger than the one that took place in Iraq last year on 350 Day, when one brave woman, that woman in the blue there, made her way through about 6 military checkpoints to hold up a banner. Auckland, New Zealand, they trained hundreds of bike mechanics who fanned out across the city and repaired every bike in every garage that they could find, so no one would have any excuse for not riding to work, you know. The Dalai Lama has been a big supporter of all of this. Place after place after place. Oh, I hadn't even seen that one before. That's pretty. Place after place after place. Here's the thing. Most of the people in the pictures are like this. They've done nothing to cause this problem. The fact that they are even willing to engage this generously with us strikes me as a great and good thing on their part. It moves me, and it should move all of us, I think, to try to respond in profound ways to the desire that they're putting forward to try still to act as a planet. There were a lot of refugees last century in this kind of bloody century that we had. But nobody knew when the century began who those refugees would be, okay? Pretty good chance that that girl in the Maldives, by the time she's 40, will have had to leave her country because the sea level will have risen enough to make it impossible for her to live there. That's what we're doing. Let me just say, as I finish here, that there are no guarantees that we're going to get this job done. It's not like other social problems that we've faced, where we knew that if eventually we'd do the right thing on civil rights or on women's rights or on whatever 'twas, it was going to be a struggle and a fight, but they were absolutely certain that in the end they would win. We do not know that, because if we don't win fairly quickly, we don't win. At a certain point, this game is over, okay, and that point's approaching. That's not to say there aren't good signs emerging. There are. You see some of them here, and you see some around this country. Since we're talking about agriculture tonight, take a moment to realize that in the last decade, we've made pretty unprecedented progress in starting to think about, for the first time in a long time, our food supply and what it's going to look like. The kind of local food movement has been quite a boon. In fact, 2 years ago, the USDA in their agricultural census reported that for the first time in 150 years, the number of farms in America was increasing, not decreasing. That's a seismic shift, and we owe some of it to people like Professor Pesek and the work that they have done to build the kind of momentum for those kind of changes. They'll help a lot in these kind of fights if we can keep them going. The question is, can we make it happen fast enough? Can we put enough political pressure on that our nation and our world will attach the price to carbon that reflects the damage it does in the environment and hence quickly leads us to use a lot less of it? I don't know the answer to that question. I can't guarantee you that we're going to win. I can only guarantee you, because I've spent the last few years in constant motion around the planet, I'm afraid, spewing carbon behind me, I can only guarantee you that there are lots and lots and lots of people in lots and lots and lots of places who will fight to the very end for this planet and this creation and this future, and it's always an incredible honor for me to get to meet them, and it's a great honor for me tonight just to be in a room full of people I know who are already engaged in this fight, and to be able to say thank you, and to be able to say I look forward to fighting side by side with you in the years ahead. Thank you all very, very much. please. Thank you very much. You do questions for a few minutes? Yeah, you figure out how to do it.
Three things are going to happen. Bill has graciously agreed to take some questions. Then we're going to have a reception with some food and drink. And then there'll be a book signing. So for the next little while, let's have microphones around in the audience. Direct questions to Bill.
And we'll just do it. I don't want to make it. I mean, feel free to leave if you need to. And we won't do a lot of questions. I don't mean to make you stay here out of politeness. I know you are a polite people, and there's questions right over here, I think.
Oh, thank you very much. That was superb. But you still didn't answer Dr. Pesick's original question. What can we do in agriculture to help with the climate change?
What can we do in agriculture to help? The way that we've constructed agriculture at the moment is as a incredibly fossil fuel intensive enterprise. The reason that we went from having 50% of Americans farming to less than 1% at the moment is because we replaced them with oil, more or less, okay? And, you know, to some degree, we took the greatest topsoil in the world here in the Midwest and increasingly just sort of used it as a matrix with which to hold plants upright so we could pour more oil over them, you know? And we're never going back to 50% of people farming. I mean, but we could have a lot more than we have. I mean, at the moment, there are twice as many people in prison in America as farming, all right? And I think it's one of the very heartening signs to see the beginning of that turnaround. More localized agriculture across much of the country would be a very useful thing. Now, look, Iowa has so much topsoil and so much fertility that it, you know, if it was only growing food for itself, you all would weigh 900 pounds, you know. So they're going to be, but the changes that could happen here could be exemplary, and they are many, many in number. And some of them involve scaling down enough so that, for instance, you know, manure goes back to being what it was originally, a useful thing in the farm, not a pollution problem, you know. Things like that. I mean, simple beginnings of diversification of the crop base would be a very good thing, all right? So that you're growing something more than corn and beans, and, you know, and that would be useful in all kinds of ways because, among other things, one of the problems as we get into this amped-up hydrological cycle that I'm describing, one of the problems is the current sort of row cropping that you've got here is a recipe for pouring water off the field and into the creek whenever there's a downpour. And if you have a greater diversity of things growing and different types of things growing and some different types of roots in the soil and things, the possibility of holding some of that water back and things will be dramatically different. I think Iowa, I mean, I don't know, you know, at some level all these are political questions, and I'm actually quite surprised at how advanced some of the thinking is, even in a state that's been traditionally very dominated by big agriculture. I think the Leopold Center probably has something to do with that, would be my guess. I was really amazed. I've been reading the accounts. My friend Michael Pollan sent me not long ago a whole series of things about one of your Iowans who's running for agricultural commissioner. Ticky? Is that how you say it? It was very, very state-of-the-art and interesting stuff. Real possibilities for profound change. And if that would start to happen in Iowa, the message it would send out to the rest of the agricultural world would be very, very profound. So there are important things to be done. More to the point, I think that the way to think about it is there are great risks to the system that you currently have. The idea, I mean, we learned in the last 2 years that our financial system was incredibly brittle. top-heavy, over-concentrated. If one thing went wrong, a lot of things went wrong. We called it too big to fail. That was the problem, okay? Well, look, our energy systems and our agricultural systems are in exactly the same place. They're over-concentrated, vulnerable, and those vulnerabilities are starting to show in profound ways. And if we have any sense, we won't let what happened with our financial system happen with them. We'll begin beforehand, before it absolutely crashes, the job of doing what in retrospect became all too clear about our financial system. So I think that there are real chances and possibilities. Shout it out so I can. Yes.
Fertilizers are a major factor in that.
Yes.
And I know they're a very oil-intensive system. And I've heard a lot of people, including Norman Borlaug, say at times that that's necessary for maintaining our current population. Is there another way?
Sure. I mean, look, we're surrounded by agronomists here, so I feel shy about even, but one of the best pieces of news in the last 10 or 15 years has been the emerging understanding among some agronomists that, in fact, there are many more options than we thought there were. That the ability that among other things, I mean, one of the things that got people thinking was noticing in data from around the world that yields per acre were higher on smaller farms for almost any crop that you cared to mention, okay? Because it turned out you could pay a lot more attention to what you were doing. If you were, I mean, I remember the first time I wandered off the road I was driving through China and was tired and just, got off to take a walk through a cornfield, of which there are plenty in northern China. And I was astonished because in between every row of corn, there's rows of green beans and rows of all kinds of things intercropped with the corn. You couldn't see it from the road, but you suddenly understood that in a place where there were more people working on the farm, there was more possibility for growing different kinds of food. Well, the rise of the sort of understanding that low-input agriculture may actually be low chemical input and fuel fertilizer input agriculture may be able to produce yields of the same level while improving instead of degrading soil may be one of the great chances that we have. It's not like we're going back to something. It's we've learned how to do a lot of things over the last century. And instead of implying quite as much fertilizer, if we applied a certain amount more information to what we're doing, we might well get someplace. It's very heartening to see in Indonesia now 1 million farmers who have gone to what they call farmer school, rice farmers, sort of self-taught how to reduce by 80-90% the amount of inputs that they're putting in and keep yields at about the same place. And what do you know? Farm income, of course, then immediately goes through the roof. Things get a lot easier. None of this transition is going to be easy, I got to tell you. Not in agriculture and not in anything else. We're pretty wedded to this system that we have. But some of that being wedded to it is psychological. And we've told ourselves so many times that there's no other way to possibly feed the world that we've started to believe it, And in fact, there are lots of ways to feed the world, just not in exactly the same fashion that we're doing now. If you're going to feed the world with only 1% of Americans farming, then you have to do it like we're doing it now, okay? But if you're willing to alter those variables somewhat, then there are other possibilities. Sure. Biofuels are an interesting topic, okay? The first thing to be said is that, let's be honest. Corn-based ethanol was not a solution to an energy problem. It was a solution to a corn problem, okay? It was... What do we do with all this corn? And if you are the huge conglomerate that owns a zillion bushels of it, then anything that you can do that will politically to drive up the price of corn is a good thing. The energy balances aren't very good. You can get, Matt and I were talking about this earlier, you can get a little more energy out of corn-based ethanol than you put in, but it's a pretty marginal enterprise, because you have to use a lot of oil to do it. If you're going to do biofuels, the obvious way to do them is with things that you don't have to spend much oil growing, So prairie grasses, switchgrass, miscanthus, something, And the other thing to be said is you're going to have to do it on marginal land. The thought that we're using the best soil in the world to grow gasoline is absurd, We don't have such a bounty of extra food in the world that we can afford to be doing that. There are 1 billion people right now the number of hungry people in the world is rising, and the reason is that the price of grain keeps rising, and the reason it keeps rising is that supply is tight, and one of the reasons is because the weather's getting bad and your yields are going down, and the other is that you're burning a lot of it up in gas tanks of cars, So if we're going to be doing that, we got to be doing it in a different way. And if we do it wisely, as on marginal land and around the edges and whatever, maybe we can do it in certain ways that allow us to, among other things, do some flood control in the process. I keep coming back to this question of flood control because I think this is going to be a problem that just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And I don't think you can have, Iowa the way you're used to having it if it floods every couple of years. I think you're going to have to figure out some serious things to do about it. The final thing I'd say about all of biofuels is trying to grow or otherwise produce enough gasoline to just keep doing the way what we do with cars and things is a fool's errand. The real job is to figure out how to use a lot less fuel, which is entirely possible to do. Have people in this probably people here have been to Western Europe sometime, some of you in recent years. You will testify that it's a reasonably dignified place where people lead lives of, okay quality and whatever. They use half as much energy per person as we do. Why? Because, they kept the price of oil high after the end of World War II. Gas has been $6 a gallon for a long time, and hence they built the greatest rail system in the world. It's not that there's like some ethnic reason that they're good at railroads, It's that they're a different set of conditions. And we've just decided the greatest thing in the world is to have endless amounts of cheap fossil fuel, and we've paid a high price for it in many ways. And a lot of those ways are ecological that I've described, but I could give you a whole other list of things that sort of begin and end with the effect on our society. One of the interesting things about this country is the percentage of Americans who say that they are very happy with their lives peaked in 1956 and has gone steadily downhill since. And the reason, when you look at the data, is because Americans say they feel a real loss of connection to community. This is not some sentimental idea that they're making up. The average American has half as many close friends as they did 50 years ago. Why? Because with the endless flow of cheap oil, we devoted most of our economic might over the last half century to the project of building bigger homes farther apart from each other. That was as a result, America is now filled with sort of starter castles for entry-level monarchs that use, unbelievable quantities of fuel and leave us sort of marooned on our own half acre someplace with no one to talk to, And this is a very long answer to a question about biofuel, I must say, but it leads to one other thing I want to say about agriculture, which is that there are really all kinds of reasons to think about this transition toward different agriculture as a really promising thing. Farmers markets have been the fastest growing part of the food economy for 10 or 15 years now, sales just going up 10, 15% a year. That's why the number of farms is increasing. So it's good for ecological reasons. You know, the 5-mile tomato beats the 5,000-mile tomato. It's actually good for culinary reasons. I've traveled 5,000 miles this week. I know how I feel. That's how the tomato also sort of feels, you know. But the real reason it's good is precisely for this sort of beginning to repair some of this social loss. A couple of years ago, a pair of sociologists followed farmers, first around the supermarket and then around the farmer's market. Okay, you all have been to the supermarket. You know how it works. You walk in, you fall into a light fluorescent trance. You visit the Stations of the Cross around the supermarket. You emerge with the same basket of items. That's about it. When they followed people around the farmer's market, they found that they had, on average, 10 times more conversations per visit. Okay? Not 10% more, 10 times more, an order of magnitude more. Okay? It's no wonder we like going there. I mean, we are socially evolved primates. Okay? This is what we like. And the only weird thing is, we think that the farmer's market is some sort of chic thing that we've invented. You know, this is how everybody on Earth shopped for food until 70 years ago, and how 80% of the planet's. Of course, we like it. You know, I guess what I'm trying to say is, the experience of America in the last 50 years, which seems completely normative to us, is deeply atypical. And trying to preserve it in all its manifestations, i.e. saying, the problem is we somehow have to come up with enough gasoline to keep doing exactly what we're doing, and if it, you know, takes all the corn in America to do it, and the price, you know, half the world starve, well, let's do it. I mean, we're asking the wrong set of questions in some fundamental way. So thank you for bearing with that answer. At this rate, we're going to go on all night, so maybe we should take one more, because I can't seem to answer things succinctly. We've got one here, and then we'll do one in back. Okay. Okay, we got the one in back first, and then we'll get one here in just a second. Okay. Is cap and trade useful? Probably not so much. Okay, this was the bill that was passed in the House and never got to a vote in the Senate that would put a cap on carbon and then allow a Byzantine system for trading it back and forth and so on and so forth. It might work, but it's a kind of complex way of doing it, as exemplified by the fact that the bill ended up being 2,000 pages long and was mostly just a kind of a piñata of gifts for various parts of the energy industry to try to keep them from blocking it, which in the end there weren't enough gifts, I guess, so they blocked it anyway. The better approach to this is a thing that economists are calling cap and dividend, or tax and dividend or something. And here's how it would work. You would put a serious cap on carbon, and you would force Exxon, whoever else, big energy producers, to buy at auction each year the right to emit those hydrocarbons. And it would cost a lot, and so they'd raise the price at the pump a lot, and you would be constantly getting the signal every time you went there that it's not a good idea to drive a military vehicle to the grocery store, you know. You'd be reminded. And that's good. We need that. But they would take all the money collected from that tax or fee or whatever you want to call it, and every month write a check to everybody in America for their share, okay? In essence, your share of the sky. And so people would be made whole. In fact, 80% of Americans would come out ahead under that plan. If you own a Learjet, you won't come out ahead. The price will be high because the price of gas will go up so much. But for most of us, we'd come out ahead. It's a way to get that price signal, and it's a way to keep people from going bankrupt. And in many ways, it's a fundamentally conservative approach to how to do this that reckons with human nature and things. And it's probably the best idea that we have. At the moment, it's such a good idea that it's not taken very seriously in Washington, but we can try to change that, and we will be over the next couple of years. I think, speaking frankly, nothing is going to happen in this country over the next 2 years on climate and energy policy. It's clear that the current Congress couldn't bring itself to do anything, and given the projections for what's going to happen in November, it's pretty clear the next Congress will do less, all right? We've got a couple of years And we don't really have any years to waste, but since we're not going to get much done, we're going to need to spend that time building a movement big enough to put serious pressure on the next time that we have an opening, political or one granted by Mother Nature. Okay, so we need you to be active in the meantime. And some of that's doing things close to home in Iowa and on campus and whatever, and some of it's staying connected at 350.org. I want you to go home and sign up at 350.org so we can keep you abreast of the opportunities that we'll be creating to work on a national and international scale. And there will be some. We're going to do a lot of things in the next few years. We're going to have to if we're going to make this movement larger and more powerful. One beautiful one to watch out for in about 6 weeks will be what we think will be the kind of largest art project that's ever happened in the world. In 20 locations around the world, we've got great artists who have sketched these designs that we're going to realize on the ground, in each case with thousands of human bodies on snowfields, on deserts, whatever. And then we've found a satellite company that donated about $1 million worth of satellite time so we can see what it looks like from outer space, the first kind of group-scale show designed to remind us that this is a fundamentally global problem, to really begin to sort of drive that message home. But we're going to have to do a lot of other stuff too, so be in touch. Let's finish up over here.
So despite the many agronomists and soil scientists and horticulturists here that are really interested in sustainable agriculture, we've derived the vast majority of our energy at Iowa State University from a coal plant. Do you think that switching to renewable energies should be our top priority for our Living Green Sustainability Initiative in the next few years?
Absolutely. Coal is the worst problem we got, and it's a very good question on which to end. Coal is the biggest problem we got because we got a lot of it, and it's always going to be tempting to use it because it's cheap. Okay, so we're going to have to muster the courage not to use it. All right, we're going to have to muster the courage to put enough price on it eventually that we stop using it because it's too expensive. But in the meantime, places like universities need to sort of model that behavior for the rest of us. Okay, and people are starting to do that work, and it's exciting to see. A group of students in Massachusetts last fall, they slept out on 20 campuses out in the quad all fall in tents and things, saying we don't want to be our dorms heated by dirty energy. And that was good, and they're getting some traction there. Places around the country, people are moving dramatically to try to get, especially on campus, coal-fired power plants and things turned off and replaced. It's not going to be easy. One of the things that's going to happen in the next year or two, I think, is that there will be more direct action and more sort of civil disobedience as part of this emerging movement. Now, I'm a little worried about that at some level. I wrote a letter with the heads of Greenpeace and the Rainforest Action Network about a month ago asking people for ideas about how to do this. But frankly, part of it makes me nervous, and it's because it can easily backfire, and it's because it can easily sort of look like something from the 60s just happening again, or we sort of turn people off. So one of the things I've been saying, and you all should think about this here if you're doing this kind of thing here, if we're going to do some serious mass action in the future, one of the things we should do is try to make sure that it's not college students who are the kind of cannon fodder for this kind of activity. If people are going to have to go sit down in front of coal-fired power plants or something someplace, well, probably it should be those of us who have spent our whole lives pouring carbon into the atmosphere that are in the forefront. And I said the other day that we were that we were going to do some protests this year like that. If we were going to do them next year, the rule was going to be that at least at the beginning, you had to have been born in the Eisenhower administration or before if you wanted to take part, And I was sort of thinking about that. I sort of got that idea because I was actually arrested in the first piece of sort of civil disobedience about climate in this country about 10 years ago. And the reason was that an old friend of mine, a wonderful woman named Doris Haddock, who everybody called Granny D, okay, this woman who at the age of 90 walked across America to protest all this stuff. A couple of years later, she'd been like the cover of Time and things when she did it, because it was really cool. But a couple of years later, she called me up and said, we're having this protest in Washington. You have to come help, you know. And, you know, I'm a well-raised fellow. If somebody who's 93 years old tells me to do something, I generally do it, you know. And so I went down, and two of us held a sign that said, stop global warming, stop campaign contributions from global warmers. We held it in the rotunda of the Capitol, which was closer than they wish you to exercise your free speech rights. And so we were arrested, and they handcuffed the two of us together, which was very funny because she's about 4'8", I think, and you know, so we're like this, you know, and she has emphysema too, and she looked up at me and she said, you know, 93. I've never been arrested. I should have started long ago, she said. So I don't know if anybody needs to get arrested. I don't know what it's all going to come to. I do know that everybody has to figure out as best they can how to do some things that really help on this. The only position, we don't know if we're going to win. There are no guarantees. If the political scientists, you know, many of them say it's just impossible. The odds are too long, you know, there's too much power and money on the other side. If you were a betting person, you might be shrewd to bet that way, that we're not going to win. But you're not allowed to make that bet. Part of the condition of being alive and conscious at a moment when the worst thing that ever happened is happening. I mean, the only moral response is to figure out what you can do to change those odds in some significant way with no guarantee of winning. And some of that's what you do at home and what you do on campus, and some of it's engaging politically at this larger level, which is what we try to do with y'all at 350.org. So we'll see. And I really will look forward to seeing many, many of you down the road in this work. Thank you all.